Is everyone good? Okay. Great. I affirm the resolution resolved. The United States ought to adopt a wealth tax. Not quite a key definition, a wealth tax is defined by the tax foundation as a wealth tax is imposed on the market value of assets, of total assets minus liabilities. Moving on, my value is morality because the word ought and the resolution implies a moral obligation. Furthermore, my criterion is minimizing structural violence. Structural violence should be at the forefront of every ethical discussion because its invisible impacts that precisely culminate into larger societal disasters. Predictions like long-term economic analysis are often incorrect, biased, or improbable, and you should focus on the people right in front of us. According to Professor Richard Jackson in 2012, big threats is one big con to distract you from structural violence. You're far more likely to die from healthcare than you are from terrorism, from stress and overwork than Iranian missiles. The media spends most time talking about threats that are unlikely to affect you. Politicians are a part of the system. To keep basic social structures in danger is also more exciting for the media. Primary function is to distract you from the inequalities in society, which are the real threats to the well-being of your family. Condition 1 is inequality. Inequality is at an all-time high. Extreme wealth concentration rigs politics to benefit the wealthy. Senior fellow Darrell West 24 writes, the top 10% of income earners earned 48% by 2023, and the current period is the highest point of inequality. The high wealth concentration made it difficult to improve economic opportunity and will be harmful for underrepresented groups. Changes in tax policy have improved the plight of the wealthy. Income tax rates have dropped, capital gains have become more advantageous, and tax avoidance has increased amongst the wealthy. Unless these policies change, income inequality will continue to grow. Empirical evidence that the wealthy have distinctive policy views, prefer low taxes, lighter regulation, and social policies that impede economic opportunities. They are less likely to support education and healthcare. This gap is racialized. Only a progressive tax can solve. Senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings, Dr. Vanessa Williamson writes at 20 that taxes have their own economic impact, and heavy taxation directly reduces the racial disparity of wealth because it reduces the highly concentrated wealth at the top. The effect of progressive taxation could easily be multiplied by devoting its revenues to programs that would increase economic equality. Switzerland proves that a wealth tax would reduce wealth concentration at the highest level. Swiss politician and economist Samira Marti writes, and others write, 23, that Swiss states, called cantons, have been taxing wealth since the early 18th century. Focusing on the large tax reforms, we find that cuts to the top marginal rate wealth tax rate in a given canton increases wealth concentration over the course of the following decades, and that tax increases reduce it. Further, inequality is the most likely long-term risk, amplifying inevitable recessions and ensuring stagnation. Executive Director and Chief Economist at Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Heather Boucher, writes in 19 that the failure to make a dent in inequality will make the next recession more difficult. Wealth inequality will be combined with deregulation that led to the crash that deepened in 2008. Policies passed by Congress have exacerbated income and wealth disparities, and recessions aren't just one-offs. Inequality affects the time it takes to recover, and it subverts our institutions and makes our political system more ineffective. Policymakers should act now by addressing inequality, as IMF economists showed that inequality is associated with downturns, and if inequality is high, economic gains are destroyed. The system is spin out of control, and inequality will increase the supply of credit, people will be left and turn to borrowing, and a rise in supply makes crises more likely. It will reduce total consumption and increase savings, and a long-term trajectory of slow growth will cause secular stagnation and a fragile state. Contention 2 is innovation. Wealth hoarding prevents productive investments. A wealth tax would solve. Economics professor at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purposes, John Ryan Collins, writes at 23 that by taxing capital gains less than income, the majority of investment flows into capture and ownership of assets of property. This does not then flow into the creation of new businesses, inventions, or useful infrastructure. Instead, society faces higher prices and rents, and raising taxes on wealth has a good chance of progressive deflation, where wages of lower earners are allowed to catch up to the rest and growth remains healthy. Even the most modest versions of wealth tax could fund small businesses and childcare for millions of families. Roosevelt University educator John Metzgar writes in 22 that wealth runs way bigger than income. A 1% wealth tax over just the top 1% would produce $500 billion a year in revenue, and here's what a plan could do with that money. We could expand child tax credit, have child care subsidies and universal pre-K, paid family leave, and expanded earned income tax credit, further baby bonds, and have a remaining revenue of $122 billion. This would all be great for our children's academic, psychological, and social development, and would transform the economics of parenting. Baby bonds would create and seed a savings account of $1,000 at the birth of every child, and then add up to $2,000 each year. They could use the money for education, start a business, or continue into a retirement account. The S&P 500's annual average stock market return has topped 11%, and a mere 1% tax would amount to little more than a rounding error. Innovation is key to responding to future threats. National Geographic editor Paul Kay writes in 20 that human history has been shaped by technology. Invention has been credited with saving more than 1 billion lives, and COVID-19 brought the world to a standstill and highlighting the need for innovative solutions that can respond quickly to emerging situations posed by climate change. Independently, there are several common criticisms that will be resolved by the implementation of the plan. First is liquidity issues. Miroslav Polonsky at the Institute of Economic Studies at Charles University in Prague writes in August that business owners who lack sufficient liquidity can transfer a fraction of their business to a wealth tax trust fund managed by the state. The state holds the shares without control, and the original business owner has the option to repurchase the business. The state can auction it off to the market, and this has been successfully implemented for the inheritance tax of artwork. 2 is capital flight. UC Berkeley professor of economics Emmanuel Saiz and Gabriel Zuckman write in 20 that the international mobility of individuals would not be a concern for the U.S. because U.S. citizens are taxable no matter where they live. A steep exit tax would be applied at the time of citizenship renunciation. Further, there are evaluation issues. That's the third point. Tax reader at the London King College, Dr. Stephen Daly, and others write in 21 that open market valuation is the preferred aim of valuation for a net wealth tax, using many current and former taxes. Valuations will be relatively easy to determine by referencing to market transactions, and innovation is assisted in that. Options are available for the most problematic assets, and costs can be constrained within 0.1% per year or less of a total chargeable assets. Thank you. I now send open across the page.
Okay, I'll start costs then. Okay. So I kind of want to start off with the definition of a wealth tax. So this is any asset that you hold, right? Anything you own.
Mm-hmm.
So your Ryan Collins evidence seems to say that instead of housing, for example, people will invest in things like stocks. Why would they do that if they're getting taxed the same amount on both of them?
Collins maybe got a similarly different argument, but Collins making a broader argument that current investments are in assets that are unproductive, things like real estate that aren't actually contributing any innovation or economic growth to the economy. Instead, people will be incentivized to invest in things like startups, new innovations that have a higher rate of profit.
Yeah, so why would they be interested in investing in like startups?
Again, because what they have to do in order to maintain their wealth at a higher level is to have a rate of profit that is higher than what the tax is so that they can continue to increase their wealth.
But
when their rate of profit is higher in more profitable businesses, therefore they take riskier developments, increase the innovation, and improves the economy.
But they're being taxed higher rates, they're being taxed the same amount for housing and for stocks, correct?
Yeah.
So what does the app do to change the ROI on investing in new businesses?
Well, sure. Our argument is that businesses have a higher ROI than businesses do because they're able to invest in things like startups, again, that have the potential to increase profit substantially. This is obviously more risky, but in the long term contributes to more innovation and higher economic growth.
I think that would indicate that should happen in the status quo anyways, but I'll move on
No,
to
because in the status quo, there's
to
less incentive to take risks.
So I'll talk about your last piece of evidence. So at the bottom it says, we caution that these estimates are based on limited information on valuation costs applying the taxes to which only a small number of parties face. So why is this still applicable?
Are you asking about the Daily 21 evidence?
Yeah.
So the Daily 21 evidence is making an argument generally about how assets could be implemented. The argument would apply to other assets as well, absent an argument as to why it would not.
Sure, I guess. Let's talk about your kind of value criterion of structural violence or mitigating it.
Sure.
So what does it mean to mitigate structural violence?
It means to look at things like government structures, social structures that cause inequality over the long term. Things like problems in tax structures, loopholes, etc. is a good example for the affirmative. Those things prevent us from taxing the wealth, ensures that racial inequality goes high, and there are other examples throughout society, but the affirmative result is a very big one.
Actually, I kind of want to talk about that. So which piece of evidence specifically says that tax revenues would go to social programs? Your evidence seems to indicate that there would be some revenue that could be used for these programs, but which evidence specifically says that it would be used for social programs?
Sure. Two pieces of evidence. The first is in the first contention. The Williamson evidence talks about how it could go to racialized communities who have been historically impacted by economic harm and discrimination.
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
Which piece of evidence specifically says that the U.S. government would do this when they don't do that in the status quo? What prevents them from just investing in the military or something?
Well, naturally, it's a question of what our advocacy is. Our argument is that they should adopt a wealth tax for this purpose, so it's the nature of what we're affirming in the resolution. Our argument is that this is a specific reason as to why the wealth tax will be invested. There will be significant revenue raised, and because that revenue is raised, part of the tax and part of the policy entails where that money is going to go. We defend that money is going to go to good places, things like resolving things like economic harms in the past, and also things like the evidence, this piece in the second evidence in the second tension, like welfare programs, things that can ensure families are more capable of raising their family and have substantial money to do that.
Okay, I sent the doc for the 1 and C, so I can do that now. And so for a quick off-the-clock roadmap, it'll be my case and then my opponent's case. And then my opponent's case, we'll start with kind of the framework debate, and then his contentions themselves. Let me know when everybody is ready.
So just one off case?
Yeah. Or you can pull the framework separately if you want.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, cool.
Just sign post, yep.
Yeah, okay. resolution, resolved. The United States ought to adopt a wealth tax framework. The value should be life, as nothing in the world can exist without it. The criterion thus should be saving lives, as you cannot do anything if you're already dead. You can't mitigate structural violence, solve for justice, etc., and you have to be alive in order to further find better solutions for these problems. For 2 reasons. One is reversibility. It forecloses the alternative because we cannot improve society if you're already dead. Second is structural violence. Death causes suffering when people can't get access to basic resources and necessities. Now, my sole contention is the economy. A recession is being narrowly avoided now. However, large government policies like the Affirmative threaten recession. Journalist Stephen Greenhouse states in 24, that unemployment is low, inflation is way down, economic growth is solid, and job growth has been strong. The country added 18 million jobs, median income climbed, a record 19 million new business applications have been filed. The stock market is climbed to record levels. The Dow Jones average is 36% higher. The Affirmative wrecks the economy for 2 reasons. Firstly, a wealth tax reduces incentives for the rich to increase or innovate for their business. Wilford says in 2020, entrepreneurship is crucial to growth. New ideas forces established players to innovate or make way. The majority of entrepreneurs are not mega corporations. 6 million businesses in the US, many subject to a wealth tax. Tax adds one more negative factor potential entrepreneurs have to make. Wealth taxes are poorly targeted. Tax rates for the lower return investor is higher. Individual is wealthy on paper but lacks cash on hand. Entrepreneurs put in a difficult position where they could be forced to dilute ownership to satisfy tax bills. Thousands of medium-sized businesses diversify their ownership, and large tax bills push them towards premature sales, limit competition as larger firms buy their smaller competitors. Entrepreneurs sell altogether. Businesses decided not to grow. The tax cliff would create a large incentive not to grow. Now, this is empirically verified by robust studies. And Najee says in 24, taxes discourage risk-taking and entrepreneurship, harming innovation and growth. A wealth tax would erode the return an entrepreneur might engage in even riskier adventures, would reduce economic output, induce foreign inflows to replace U.S. savings. Secondly, the Affirmative causes the innovative wealthy to move away. Senior economist Lee states in 2015 that economists empirically verified that taxes chase away superstar inventors, contributors who have valuable patents. Based on data for 8 OECD countries, the study finds that there is a negative correlation between tax and foreign investors. The top 1% inventors are significantly affected. Inventors are more mobile, and they are the key determinants of growth. Immigrants account for 25% of innovation and entrepreneurship. A recession is the worst possible thing that can happen right now. Here's why. Firstly, continued recession after COVID ensures global conflict from diversionary wars because of economic decline. Malik says in 21, a second Great Depression would have profound implications for global security. The catalyst behind World War II was the Depression. History repeats itself. Balloon effects include war, confrontation, proliferation. Secondly, even if you think that those impact scenarios are unlikely, economic decline means much more inequality for 3 reasons. That means they can't even solve their own impacts. IMF says in 02, crises deepen poverty and inequality in a number of ways. Weaker economic activity. Workers' earnings fall as jobs are lost, demand for services declines, working hours and wages are cut. Relative price changes. Financial crisis involves currency depreciation, which changes relative prices. Depreciation may affect consumer prices. Higher costs of food hurts poor individuals. Fiscal retrenchment. Governments respond to crises by tightening monetary and fiscal stances, leading to cuts in social programs. Now, moving on to my opponent's case. First, the morality argument. Just because the word ought is in the resolution doesn't necessarily mean it outweighs anything. The Jackson evidence is wrong. Even if structural violence is embedded, it cannot be solved through one-shot action. It also assumes that all lives matter, which means that our framework is a side constraint. And these are not big threats. There's been literal war in the Middle East, and economic recessions have empirically occurred before. Next, moving on to the rest of their first contention. First, our contention is a turn to inequality. Economic decline obviously hurts the poorest the most, so we turn their impact. Inequality has been happening forever, so you know that our contention is the only one with a direct impact because they cannot solve 100% of inequality. Second, the Affirmative encourages the mega-rich to offload assets towards political donations. That allows them to dictate the direction of the government and lobby for policies that are anti-competitive. Blackman says in 2019, the wealth taxes encourage the very rich to spend giving money to political candidates, increase political influence. If your assets above some level is subject to a stiff tax, you'll have strong incentive to keep your wealth below that threshold. A wealth tax would affect politics. Parties gave $123 million in campaign contributions, Bloomberg donated $95 million, and 13 each gave $10 million. Give rich outsized influence in the general direction of government policy. Political donations is a way to offload wealth and avoid tax liability. Super wealthy could use influence to convince policymakers to repeal the tax. Third, an effective wealth tax is impossible to enforce even with more resources. York says in 21, legislation includes $100 million for the IRS. It is not clear the IRS would be able to collect, even if resources were increased, audit rates and exit taxes. Suggests a comprehensive wealth tax would be difficult to enforce. Several countries in the OECD chose to repeal limited revenue, administrative and compliance costs, and evasion. Large administration challenges for the IRS. Fourth, their cards are completely irrelevant. They're about Switzerland, which is not the Affirmative, and there's absolutely no guarantee that the tax revenue goes to social programs. Obviously, the government could just spend it on things like the defense budget. Next, Moving on to my opponent's second contention. They talk about the economy, however, our contention is a complete turn to this argument, because it proves that instead of improving the economy, they reduce it by reducing the incentive to innovate and push entrepreneurs out. Second, our link to the economy outweighs. Theirs relies on an unsustainable method of spending, which creates inflation risks, whereas ours is more productive innovation. Third, the Ryan colleagues' evidence is completely illogical. The app creates no incentive to invest in anything new because people will just get their profits taxed away anyways. And stocks are taxed in the exact same way as, for example, a house or a car is, because these are obviously assets that are taxed under a wealth tax. They cannot change that stocks are still appreciating more than, for example, the status quo, which means that they cannot change the structure that makes small businesses better to invest in or less good to invest in, which means that it's not sufficient to solve any of their impacts. Cross-examination just said that, well, they need higher rates of return, but again, this is incorrect because the rate of return itself does not change. Fourth, their revenue arguments are empirically disproven. Onache says in 24 that wealth taxes accounted for very small shares of revenue, from 0.19% in Spain to 1.19%. Trends show revenues remain stable or declined. Only exception is Switzerland. In Norway, despite higher tax revenues appear to be low. Fifth, their answer to capital flight is completely wrong. It assumes that people do not give up their citizenship and that the government adds on an exit tax, which isn't part of the resolution, so they can't defend this as a sort of argument because they literally do not defend that as part of the resolution, and so that is not resolutional. Sixth, their answer to this sort of evaluation argument is wrong. Their DALI evidence literally says, quote, however, we caution that these estimates are based on limited information on valuation costs applying to taxes, which only a small number of parties face, and that the information may bear little resemblance to the wholesale changes in valuers' cost structures that the introduction of a wealth tax could prompt. That means that their DALI evidence is not sufficient to prove that this is necessarily a true evaluation of the way that the IRS can necessarily collect taxes, so our evidence outweighs, especially because we are the only ones with empirical evidence that actually has been shown from past examples of a wealth tax, and that most countries have necessarily repealed it for the exact same reason. So for those reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. I stand open for cross-examination.
Great. Are you ready? Oh, sorry, yeah, of course you are. First question has to do with your impact story on your first contention. You talk about economic decline. How does economic decline contribute to war?
Yeah, so two things. Firstly, you might be like, oh, well, this is very improbable. However, we have another argument why sort of economic decline would be bad.
Sure, I want to focus on the war stuff.
Yeah, so the Mavic evidence kind of indicates that, for example, if there was a second Great Depression, that would have a large impact on global security.
Okay.
Basically,
Great Depression, that's a really big economic decline. How do we quantify the amount of economic decline that will result from the affirmative?
Well, first of all, I don't think it needs to be quantified as long as we win that there's a large impact to the economy as per the contention.
Okay, what's the bright line for large, though? You said that the affirmative will result in some economic decline, but how do we know that won't result in just some small recession or even a recession at all versus a Great Depression?
Our evidence indicates that it would, quote, be significantly affected, things like how it would significantly affect innovation, etc., how the wealth tax would be, quote, poorly targeted, and things like that, which means you know for certain that even if it is not quantifiable, how am I supposed to quantify this? Like the economy declines by 52%, like I don't.
Yes, that's a reason actually is why the probability of the impact is exceptionally low.
Wait,
but we'll take it as a given that the economy collapses. Sure, why does that cause countries to turn outwards looking for more?
Yeah, so for example, you can think about things like in World War II, right, where the Depression was kind of a catalyst behind what happened. So for example, in Germany, there was a recession, and so people kind of started rallying behind populist leaders, etc. And you can think about historical examples like that as well.
So why didn't that happen more recently with examples like the 2008 crisis and or COVID big collapse then?
Yeah, so a couple things. Firstly is that we have read unique evidence that says that currently geopolitical risks are uniquely high. So think about places like Iran, Israel, US-China military confrontation.
Were these places not conflictual during the 2020 period?
Our argument is that it's been growing in tension. So if you've been keeping up with the news like Iran, Israel, they're just escalating right now, and so it is like on the brink of getting way, way worse.
Sure. Okay, let's talk about the Gleckman 19 evidence. Where does your evidence indicate the rich will spend their money?
Oh, which part?
The Gleckman 19 evidence about political investment.
Yeah, so the Gleckman evidence says that it encourages the very rich to spend more money. We have empirical examples. So for example...
Sure, so that's already happening right now. So how does the affirmative contribute to the problem if it's already a current problem?
If you think about the way that politics currently work, it's like kind of equal right now. However, the affirmative would kind of push it over the brink.
Why?
Because it encourages... Yeah, because the app basically taxes these billionaires by a huge amount, right? So they're like, oh, well, now my assets themselves, like my physical assets, are getting taxed, so I need to put them into a different place that is not going to get taxed, but will
But if
still be
they're
richer,
already capable of lobbying to reduce deregulations by a substantial amount, why did it not already produce them a significantly higher rate of profit? Why would they not already be lobbying for these things now?
They didn't need to do so yet. However, the tax would be such a large amount that people are necessarily, like, they need to do this. If you are right that this tax is kind of such a small amount that it doesn't affect billionaires that much, then it can't even solve your own contention because it doesn't solve inequality.
All right. 4 minutes of prep starting now. Okay, a minute, 15 seconds, take it. I'll send a card. Okay, it's sent. The order will be my contentions in order, and then my opponent's case in the order that I've written. Everyone good?
Wait, sorry. Where was the framework to be done? Or is
It's going to be done on the NC.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm good.
Okay. Our first contention is inequality. A wealth tax can solve by redistributing wealth and investing into community development programs. That resolves inequality, which makes our political and economic institutions more reliable because it puts more money into circulation. They make a couple of responses. The first argument of inequality will be answered on their contentions, but neglected evidence. West proves that by lobbying is the status quo. People are already putting hundreds of millions of dollars into corporations, and the only way into the election process, and the only way to resolve that is to decrease the amount of wealth that has occurred at the top. The affirmative is key to long-term resolving these issues. 2, things like resolving taxes still need public support because we still live in a democracy. They have no indication that these things are popular. 3rd, the IRS evidence indicates it is difficult to evaluate assets, but not impossible. This is mitigatory defense at best, but there's also no reason as to why natural means of the affirmative would not massively increase revenue for the IRS through things like the revenue generated by the tax, which would give it the ability to leverage more manpower. 4th, we can make arguments about where the revenue goes. That is part of our advocacy. Real-world people advocating for a wealth tax garner their offense and garner their support by talking about where that money would go. We are much more realistic. The second contention proper is innovation. A wealth tax spurs innovation by incentivizing more efficient investment from the rich and enabling entrepreneurship amongst the poor. That boosts the economy. The 1 and 2 arguments will be answered on their case, and their third point. Higher wealth, what may entail higher wealth tax, but it is also the only thing that is ensuring that the current wealth tax and the current bracket is not taxing the people too much. It is still there, people are still incentivized to ensure that they have the highest rate of profit as possible, because that is the only possibility of imagining in which they can actually still ensure that they have some sort of money and they're gaining. 4th, we have more money or wealthy individuals than Switzerland, so this argument is not comparative. 5th, natural enforcement is the exit tax will be natural enforcement. The affirmative would obviously require things like IRS to get creative in determining how the bureaucracy determines to prevent these things, so this is obviously something that the affirmative can defend. The 6th point about revenue being difficult. Just because revenue correction is difficult does not mean that it is worse. This was answered on the IRS argument. Now onto my opponent's case. Starting with our framework, 1, the value of morality begs the question of what we care about life. We only care about life because we seek to answer the question of what is moral. Therefore, morality is the higher value criterion. Therefore, the value criterion ought to be minimizing structural violence. We take it as a general statement that life is important. However, we take it as a more specific claim that it is more important to resolve structural violence because the life loss of structural violence is much more probable and outweighs on cyclicality over time because it is constantly outweighed of impacts of magnitude and exceptionally low probability, which outweighs any of their impacts. Now onto their first case, onto their contention proper. The first argument is that entrepreneurs will be subjected to a very small amount of tax because those people people have not garnered their wealth yet. Even though they might be taxed in a lower bracket, that latter bracket would be exceptionally low. 2, turn. They conceded because we create investment into more profitable investments. It causes people to take riskier investments over time, which leads to long-term economic growth. 3rd, on capital flight. A point, they consider that people are taxable anywhere, which means that they want to have investments in the US, they still need to remain US citizens. B is that a swift exit tax will be employed. But C is that they consider that other factors influence migration, e.g. things like education or institutions within the United States. 4th, there is an exceptionally small internal link between all their arguments about economic decline and a Great Depression. There is no reason to suggest that a decline of a significant magnitude is something that would cause a 5% GDP decrease, which is what the Great Depression was. That is arbitrary. 5th, they conceded the small businesses term. The revenue generated by the tax would be doing things like giving the lower income people the funding to support and to create their own businesses, which would boost long-term economic growth in the process. Independently, there is a very small risk of economic decline. No one wants to go to war when they're out of money. That's Waltz 20. The United States has suffered 40 recessions, yet it has fought 20 wars unrelated to the economy. If recessions cause war, we would have predicted 9 out of the last 5. States do not start wars unless they think they will start and achieve victory. The motivation for wars is security and not economic gain. They say that the world is currently tense, but these tensions have existed for decades. 2020 was also a very tense region, and in the 2000s we had conflict in the Middle East. Conflict inevitably exists. Independently on poverty, they have conceded that economic decline is inevitable when inequality happens, and recessions are inevitable. But they're only much worse when inequality happens, which means solving inequality is key.
Okay, I'll start prep. I have 4 minutes. the order will be my case and then my opponent's case.
Okay. I'm ready.
Is everyone else here? I'll get started. Judge, the framing issue for this debate is that even if they are winning that their criterion of mitigating structural violence is important, we are a complete turn under this. But I will still answer the framework debate anyways. First, the value ought to be life. They say that morality begs the question of whether we care about life, but no, that is illogical. Life is a prerequisite to morality because we cannot be moral without having life. Also, our argument is that life is the most important value because we care about life because it is intrinsically valuable. Additionally, they say minimizing structural violence outweighs because of probability and cyclicality. However, these are obviously outweighed. They conceded that magnitude is a greater question because it does cause structural violence and other problems because it harms everybody. Also, they conceded that they can never resolve structural violence absent being alive, so we are a prior question to addressing any other impacts. Now, I'm extending my contention. The affirmative's plan causes massive economic decline. Right now, the economy is recovering, but extremely unstable. That means it's vulnerable to economic shifts in markets. A wealth tax would cycle our economy in two ways. First, crushing incentives. When profits are drained by taxes, entrepreneurs lose the drive to take risks, build businesses, and push boundaries. Why innovate if the reward is diminished? This isn't just theory. The Anachi evidence shows that through OECD studies, taxing away profits has real consequences on entrepreneurial drive and innovation. We are the only side that has empirical evidence to support our claims, so you should err heavily negative in this debate. Second, capital flight. The policy would encourage the most innovative and successful people to pack up and take their talents elsewhere. If they move, they not only take their capital, but also cutting-edge ideas and investments our economy relies on. Our lead evidence based on a study across 8 OECD countries proves that capital flight from the wealthy is a real and serious risk. That outweighs their arguments for 3 reasons. First, it turns poverty. Whenever there is economic decline, you know that from 2008 and the Great Depression that it hurts the poorest the most because they are not able to buy resources, and especially because there are things like currency depreciation. Secondly, it means the government must cut other social programs because they are unable to fund these properly, which is empirically proven and a dropped argument. Third is economic decline. Think about it logically. Economic recession causes massive impacts. Even if not war, we just saw the impacts of COVID-19, and examples like World War II provide that decline can also cause war because of things like populist sentiment, and other examples, so you know that it is uniquely likely. Now, moving on to their arguments. Firstly, they say there's very little tax for small businesses. However, they conceded it's wrong. The framing issue is that they dropped a welfare evidence that says that wealth taxes are poorly enforced, and that means that some of the lower income people could be taxed even more. Additionally, because they tax the people that are wealthy on paper but lack actual cash, which means that people are actually just getting harmed in this argument as a whole. Additionally, there is not really a reason for why small businesses matter, because if investors are all losing their money, then nobody invests in these businesses, even if small businesses are the ones that are actually creating inventions, because they need investors that do not exist anymore. Second, they say we create profitable investment. Wrong. They conceded that this is irrelevant because stocks and physical assets are taxed the same amount. Think about it like this. They cannot change anything because stocks are still technically more productive, but obviously the affirmative doesn't do anything to change that because the wealth tax is still the same to both sides. Currently, investing in small businesses is still more profitable, but clearly people disagree. This argument is just illogical, which answers their argument on their case. Now, the capital flight argument. The A point is wrong. People obviously will be willing to give up citizenship to be able to move to a different country, empirically proven. Additionally, they say exit taxes are employed. Wrong. They conceded that people move even with an exit tax, and also that it's not topical to assume that you can just enact another exit tax. And lastly, they say other factors influence migration. There was no explanation for what other factors influence it, but only we have empirical studies which outweigh. Fourth, they say small interlink between the economy declining and Great Depression. There is a large enough decline that causes massive amounts of violence. You've seen how decline ripples through the recession, which proves that this is true. Fifth, this argument is wrong. They conceded that the affirmative does not get enough revenue because they conceded the Anachi evidence that says that multiple trends show that revenues remain stable or declined after a wealth tax, which is the only empirical evidence in the entirety of the debate. Sixth is low economic decline. Nobody goes to war when they're out of money. Again, this card is wrong because it doesn't assume current tensions. They kind of tried to preempt this by saying 2020 had conflicts, but again, no, there are unique brinks now because of the Iranian-Israeli tension, Taiwanese tension, etc. These are all brink spots, especially if you're reading the news and know that these are currently escalating and status quo and only will get worse. Seven, poverty. They said, since both of their impacts turn each other, it is a question of which we can solve more feasibly. And Judge, I give you that is the negatives and impacts. Because you do not know whether you can solve poverty. In fact, they conceded that they cannot, and that structural violence is inevitable. However, you do know that economic growth can at least momentarily be able to be good and solve their impacts, so it necessarily outweighs. Now, moving on to my opponent's case. Firstly, they conceded that revenue is very minimal, so it basically cannot solve any of their social programs offense because they cannot increase social programs insofar as there's not enough revenue to do so. But on their inequality contention itself, the framing issue is neglecting evidence. This argument is the best piece of evidence in this debate. When people are getting their wealth taxed, they will not move it to small businesses. Rather, they will move it to political donations because that is most effective because it will allow them to pass anti-competitive practices and even repeal the tax, for example. Now, they say West proves that lobbying is in the status quo. Again, no, because lobbying between both sides are almost equal now, but they conceded that the affirmative will skew it far in one direction, or at least towards anti-competitive practices, because people will be so annoyed. Second, they say taxes require public support because we live in a democracy. Wrong. We live in a representative democracy, which means that we vote for politicians that decide our policies. And obviously, obviously people might not know whether this lobbying is actually happening, especially because our evidence indicates that this is happening on the not super visually, you can't really see this impact in society right now. So you know that it is something that is happening secretively. Additionally, they functionally conceded that you cannot enforce the affirmative. They say the app increases revenue for the IRS, but they conceded our evidence that says that legislation has already increased revenue, but was insufficient to resolve their offense. Several countries necessarily prove that the downsides far outweigh and there's much less revenue than there is administrative cost of implying this tax. Because remember, the IRS needs a bunch more money, and so that is going to take out all the revenue that they can have. Now, their econ contention, again, was all answered above. Their argument about how they can have productive investments, that was also answered before, and their social programs argument was also answered before. So all of these arguments can be falsified. Only we have empirical evidence, so that should frame your ballot. That is the most important impact in this debate, and it definitively turns theirs.
Cool. 2:45. Great. The order will be for the framework debate, my case, and then my opponent's case, and the voting issues at the end. Is everyone ready?
Okay.
Great. Starting on the framework debate, the value debate has become circular. Instead, you should evolve to the value criterion because both of us think morality and human life are important. Instead, it's a question of how you preserve human life through evaluating structural violence. They conceded that structural violence harms everybody the same way magnitude does. Inequality affects more people than more, so it outweighs on magnitude. But it results in more death because we constantly disavow it. That is Jackson. It means it outweighs on cyclicality because we instead focus on large-scale impacts with significantly lower probability because we think that they will happen more often, but they actually don't, which means you should be biased towards structural violence effects, which is what our Jackson evidence indicates. The affirmative case proper. Starting on our first contention, inequality can be solved by redistributing wealth and investing into community development programs. They have conceded 100% strength of solvency on the redistribution part of the affirmative, which means we solve inequality. But the lemma line proper, on revenue, 1. Even a 1% tax would generate $500 billion, which means that revenue, even if it has problems, is still substantial. 2. On politics, A, we get durable fiat. The tax cannot get overturned on the affirmative, otherwise it would be infinitely abusive because resolutions that are unpopular would never be debated. B, we can weigh a very little risk of some more additional funding over the possibility of the affirmative resolving all lobbying in the future because we massively reduce the wealth of the bourgeoisie in order to invest, because their impact is already not unique. The democracy stuff, people have some idea of what their representatives do. If they're obviously going to do super corrupt things, they won't vote for them, and they have no evidence on this question. 4, enforcement. IRS enforcement can be funded more. They conceded that's the problem. Given the fact that the app is raising revenue by billions of dollars, it definitely solves the gap there. Now the NC proper. There are several problems with their link chain. 1 is innovation. Entrepreneurs will still innovate. There is still a possibility of making tens of millions of dollars before they are even taxed at all. Would you innovate then? I think you would. Second of all is that even if there's a marginal tax revenue, you can still end up accumulating large portions of wealth. You would not just give up the opportunity cost of living a exceptionally wealthy lifestyle for the rest of your life because you know that you'll be taxed marginally. Now the enforcement question. The IRS is great. Their defense is mitigatory as best because we are not other countries. They conceded we have international enforcement, and even if there is some problem, we can still raise considerable revenue. Now, the third, stocks, because people invest in stocks because they have higher ROIs. It is obviously a much better place to hold your wealth, and they drop that leads to innovation. But we're not going for innovation, we're going for inequality. Fourth, exit tax is absolutely normal means. It would seize the majority of wealth, which means that even if people leave, they can still contribute that wealth to the tax. Otherwise enforcement of the affirmative would never happen. This is what real policy analysts talk about when they talk about wealth tax, which means an exit tax is definitely included. 5, Anashri is not only empirical evidence. Our evidence has the opposite, and the U.S. has much more wealthy individuals than Switzerland. The impact debate. 1, they conceded our framework, which means that the war scenario is completely bunked, but independently, their argument about Taiwan is not implicated in 1 and C evidence anywhere in the round. But even if, you should prefer the affirmative because they conceded that economic decline is inevitable. The only thing the affirmative changes is whether or not that economic decline is over longer periods of time or not. They conceded that the affirmative will lead to innovation because of small businesses, which means that would definitely counteract the economy. Look, they have not quantified the scale of economic collapse, but we have quantified the risk of inequality. Proves that it would mean that things like inequality, like economic declines, last significantly longer, which causes all their harms and makes them exponentially higher. Good round.